I turned the key in the lock of my childhood home, my navy duffel bag still slung over my shoulder, and pushed open the door expecting the smell of my father's pipe tobacco and my mother's lavender sachets. Instead, I was hit with the echo of my own footsteps on bare hardwood floors. The house was empty, not messy, not ransacked, empty. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every dish, every memory, gone. Stripped clean like a carcass picked over by vultures. I stood in the doorway of what used to be our living room, my hand still on the doorknob, my mind unable to process what my eyes were seeing. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the naked windows, illuminating rectangles of darker wood where furniture had stood for decades, protecting the floor from the sun's bleaching rays. The walls were bare except for the picture hooks, little metal reminders of all the family photographs that used to hang there. Even the curtains were gone. Even the goddamn light fixtures had been removed, leaving just exposed wires and empty ceiling boxes. I'd been deployed for 14 months. 14 months aboard the USS Fitzgerald, operating in the Western Pacific, running surveillance operations and freedom of navigation exercises. 14 months of 12-hour shifts, powdered eggs, and sleeping in a rack so small I couldn't turn over without hitting my head. 14 months of holding on to one thought that kept me sane. I was coming home to Portland, Oregon, to the Victorian house on Hawthorne Street where I'd grown up, where every creaky floorboard and cracked ceiling told a story. My father had died 7 months into my deployment. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed and dead within 6 weeks. The Navy had denied my emergency leave request. We were in the middle of a critical operation, my CO said, and I was essential personnel, so I'd missed his funeral. I'd missed the chance to say goodbye to the man who'd raised me alone after my mother died in a car accident when I was 9 years old. I'd stood on the deck of the ship at sunset, crying into the Pacific Ocean while my shipmates pretended not to notice, holding a memorial service for one. But the house was supposed to still be here. My father's lawyer had sent me an email assuring me that everything was being handled, that the estate was in order, that I shouldn't worry about anything while I was deployed. He'd said the house was being maintained until I returned. This wasn't maintained. This was gutted. This was erased. I walked through the empty rooms in a daze, my boots echoing on the bare floors. The dining room where we'd eaten Sunday dinners for 18 years, empty. The kitchen where Dad had taught me to make his mother's soda bread recipe, stripped of appliances, cabinets hanging open to reveal nothing but dust. The study where he'd spent hours reading medical journals and writing research papers, his desk gone, his books gone, the leather chair I used to curl up in while doing homework completely vanished. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking in that familiar way, the sound the same even though everything else was different. My childhood bedroom, the room with the window seat where I'd spent countless hours reading, the closet where I'd hidden during thunderstorms when I was little, the wall where I'd measured my height every birthday in pencil marks that now stood alone against blank paint. Gone. The bed, the dresser, the bookshelf my father had built himself when I was 6, the collection of horse figurines I'd accumulated over years of birthdays and Christmases. All of it gone. My father's bedroom was the worst. The big 4-poster bed where he'd comforted me after nightmares, where he'd sat up reading when insomnia struck, where he'd died, according to the hospice nurse's report, peacefully in his sleep. Empty. Even the photographs of my mother that he'd kept on his nightstand were missing. Even the quilt my grandmother had sewn, the one that had been on that bed for 40 years, was gone. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called the one person who should have answers. Gerald Foster, my father's estate attorney. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. You've reached the law offices of Foster and Associates. We're currently closed for the holiday weekend. Please leave a message. Holiday weekend. It was Memorial Day weekend. I'd specifically timed my return for after the holiday, so I wouldn't have to deal with crowds at the airport, so I could come home quietly and grieve privately. But now I was trapped in this empty shell of a house with no answers and no way to get them until Tuesday. I sank down onto the floor in the middle of the living room, my back against the wall where our couch used to be, and let myself cry for the first time since my father's death. Not just for him, but for everything. For the childhood that was supposed to still exist in these walls. For the memories that had been packed up and hauled away like they meant nothing. For the violation of coming home to discover that someone had stolen my entire life. And I knew exactly who that someone was. Patricia. My father's wife of 2 years. The woman he'd married in a small ceremony I'd attended on leave. The woman who'd seemed pleasant enough at the time. The woman who'd sent me cheerful emails during my deployment about how she was taking care of everything while I was gone. She'd taken care of everything, all right. She'd taken every single thing. I spent that first night sleeping on the floor of my empty bedroom, using my duffel bag as a pillow, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what had happened. The house still had electricity and running water, which meant someone was still paying the bills. But there was no furniture, no food in the kitchen, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here. It felt like a stage set after the play had ended and the crew had struck everything. Tuesday morning, I was waiting outside Gerald Foster's office when he arrived at 8:30 a.m. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and expensive suits, the kind of lawyer who'd handled my family's legal matters since before I was born. When he saw me standing there, his face went pale. "Sarah," he said, fumbling with his briefcase, not quite meeting my eyes. I wasn't expecting you back quite so soon. I thought your discharge date was next month." "Early release," I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "I need to talk to you about the house, about everything being gone." He unlocked the door and led me inside to his office, which was cluttered with legal books and file folders and photographs of his grandchildren. He sat down behind his desk but didn't offer me a chair, probably because he could see I was too angry to sit anyway. "Sarah, I want you to know that I advised against this course of action," he began, pulling out a file with my father's name on it. "I told Patricia that she should wait until you returned, that she should discuss these matters with you directly. But legally, she had every right to—" "Every right to what?" I interrupted, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Every right to empty my father's house? Every right to steal everything I own? Every right to erase my entire childhood?" "She didn't steal anything," Gerald said carefully. "According to your father's will, the house and all its contents passed to Patricia as his surviving spouse. She chose to exercise her right to liquidate those assets. The furniture, the personal belongings, everything. She sold it all through an estate sale company. It was completely legal." The words hit me like a physical blow. My father wouldn't do that. He wouldn't leave everything to her and nothing to me. That's insane. Gerald pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but this is your father's will. It was executed 2 years ago, shortly after he married Patricia. Everything goes to her. The house, the contents, his retirement accounts, everything. There's no provision for you at all." I stared at the will, reading the words, but not believing them. "I, Daniel Robert Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby leave all my worldly possessions to my beloved wife, Patricia Ann Morrison." The signature looked like my father's. The date was correct. The witnesses were people I'd never heard of. "This is wrong," I said, my voice shaking. "Dad promised me this house. When Mom died, he sat me down and told me that this house would always be mine, that it was my inheritance, that I'd always have a home to come back to. He wouldn't break that promise." "People change their minds," Gerald said, not unkindly. "Your father was in love. He wanted to take care of his new wife. And frankly, Sarah, you joined the Navy and made your own life. Maybe he thought you didn't need the house anymore. So where's Patricia now? I demanded. Where's all my stuff? Where are my mother's things, my photographs, My voice broke, and I hated myself for it. Gerald's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy. Patricia moved to California about 3 months ago. She sold the contents of the house through Portland estate sales. You can contact them if you want to try to track down specific items, though I doubt they kept records of who bought what. As for the house itself, she's listed it for sale. It should close escrow within the next few weeks. The room spun. She's selling the house? My house? It's her house, Sarah. Legally, unambiguously, completely hers. I know this is difficult to hear, but you have no claim to this property or anything in it. The will is valid, it was properly executed, and the estate has been settled. I stood up so fast the chair would have fallen over if there had been one. Give me her contact information. I need to talk to her. Gerald hesitated, then wrote down a phone number and an address in San Diego. I should warn you that Patricia has made it very clear she doesn't want any contact with you. She feels that you're being unreasonable about the estate, that you're trying to make trouble. If you harass her, she's prepared to file for a restraining order. Harass her? I could barely get the words out. She stole my entire life and I'm the one who's being unreasonable? She didn't steal anything, Gerald repeated. She inherited it. There's a difference, legally speaking. I called Patricia 17 times that day. She never answered. Finally, at 11 p.m., and I received a text message from her number. Stop calling me. Everything was done legally. Your father made his choice. Accept it and move on. I couldn't accept it. I wouldn't. So I did what any good sailor does when faced with an impossible situation. I started investigating. I went to Portland estate sales the next morning and asked to see records from the Morrison estate sale. The manager, a woman in her 50s named Karen, looked uncomfortable when I explained who I was. I remember that sale, she said quietly. It was unusual. Mrs. Morrison was very specific about wanting everything gone as quickly as possible. She didn't want us to do our usual cataloging and photography. She wanted it sold in one weekend. Everything must go, rock-bottom prices. We tried to tell her she was leaving money on the table, that some of those antiques were valuable, but she didn't care. She just wanted it gone. Do you remember what was sold? I asked, desperate for any information. Was there a desk? A specific desk, walnut wood with carved legs? Karen checked her computer. We sold so much. 12 bedroom sets, dining room furniture, a study full of books and medical equipment, kitchen items, art, photographs. She looked up at me with genuine sympathy. Everything. We cleared that house in 2 days, made about $40,000 total, which was way under what it should have been worth. Your stepmother seemed more interested in speed than value. What about personal items? Photographs, documents, things that weren't really sellable? There were boxes of papers and photographs. Mrs. Morrison told us to throw them away if they didn't sell. Karen hesitated. I didn't feel right about that. So I saved a few boxes, the ones that looked important. They're in my storage unit. I was going to try to contact you, but I didn't have your information. And Mrs. Morrison said you were overseas and wouldn't want them anyway. Hope flared in my chest. Can I see them? Please? An hour later, I was sitting in Karen's storage unit, going through 3 boxes of items she'd saved from the sale. Photographs of my mother, of me as a child, of my father's medical school graduation, my baby book, my mother's jewelry box, a shoebox full of letters my father had written to my mother during their courtship. Things that should never have been for sale. Things that had no monetary value but were priceless to me. At the bottom of the 3rd box, I found something that made my heart stop. A leather journal with my father's handwriting. I opened it with shaking hands and started reading. It was a diary of sorts, entries dating from his cancer diagnosis, through the weeks before his death. March 15th. Doctor confirmed it's stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 3-6 months at best. Need to get affairs in order. Need to protect Sarah. Patricia doesn't know about the diagnosis yet. Dreading telling her. March 22nd, told Patricia about the cancer. Her reaction was strange. Not sad, exactly. Almost relieved? Am I imagining things? The morphine makes it hard to think clearly. April 3rd, Patricia brought up the will today. Said we should update it since we're married now. Make sure she's taken care of if something happens to me. I told her I'd already made provisions. She seemed angry. Why angry? April 10th. Found Patricia going through my desk. She said she was looking for insurance documents. But my desk was locked. How did she get in? April 18th. Gerald Foster came by to discuss the will. Patricia sat in on the meeting. She was very insistent that everything should go to her as my spouse. Gerald seemed uncomfortable. I need to talk to him privately. April 25th. Patricia has been giving me my medication, but I feel worse, not better. Sicker than I should be at this stage. Am I being paranoid? The entries continued, growing more disjointed as his illness progressed. But a pattern emerged. My father had been suspicious of Patricia. He'd been worried about her intentions, and he'd been trying to protect me. The final entry was dated May 3rd, about 3 weeks before he died. Called Jonathan Hayes. Old friend from medical school, practices estate law in Seattle. Asked him to draw up new documents. Can't let Patricia know. Too weak to fight. But need to protect Sarah. Need to protect the house. It's all Sarah has left of her mother. Have plan. Jonathan knows what to do. Hope Sarah finds this. Hope she understands. Love you, baby girl. Always. I drove to Seattle that same day, calling the law office of Jonathan Hayes from the road. When I explained who I was and mentioned my father's name, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ms. Morrison, the receptionist said carefully, Mr. Hayes has been trying to reach you for months. Can you please hold? 2 minutes later, a man's voice came on the line. Sarah, this is Jonathan Hayes. Thank God you're stateside. I've been sending emails to the address your father gave me, but they kept bouncing back. What emails? What are you talking about? I need you to come to my office immediately. I can't discuss this over the phone. How soon can you be here? 3 hours later, I was sitting in Jonathan Hayes's office in downtown Seattle, listening to him explain something that made no sense and perfect sense at the same time. Your father came to see me in May, about 6 weeks before he died, Jonathan said. He was in his 60s, gray-haired and distinguished, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He was very ill, could barely walk, but he was determined. He told me he suspected his wife was poisoning him, not to kill him directly, but to keep him weak and confused so she could manipulate him. Poisoning him? He couldn't prove it, and honestly, given how sick he already was from the cancer, it would have been almost impossible to detect. But he was lucid enough to know what he wanted. He wanted to protect you in the house. So we drew up a new deed. Jonathan pulled out a file and showed me a document that made my breath catch. This is a quitclaim deed transferring the property at 1847 Hawthorne Street from Daniel Morrison to Sarah Catherine Morrison, you, dated May 5th, 2023. It was notarized, witnessed, and recorded with Multnomah County on May 6th. Your father transferred the house to you before he died, Sarah. Legally, that house has been yours for over a year. I stared at the deed, my hands shaking. But Gerald Foster said Patricia inherited everything. He showed me a will that left everything to her. The will probably is legitimate, for personal property, bank accounts, things like that. But the house isn't part of the estate, because your father no longer owned it when he died. He gave it to you. The deed was recorded publicly, which means anyone who did a title search would have found it. But if Patricia and her lawyer didn't do a title search, if they just assumed the house was still in your father's name, Jonathan leaned forward. They committed fraud, Sarah. If Patricia sold or is trying to sell a house she doesn't own, that's theft. That's criminal. Why didn't you contact me sooner? Why didn't you tell me about this? I tried, Jonathan said, pulling out copies of emails. Your father gave me an email address for you, but every message I sent bounced back. I tried calling the number he gave me, but it was disconnected. I even tried contacting the Navy, but they wouldn't give me any information about your location due to operational security. I was starting to think I'd never find you. I looked at the email address on the letters. It was close to mine, but not quite right. One letter different in the username. My father had been sick, confused, dying. He'd gotten one letter wrong, and that mistake had kept me from knowing about this for over a year. What do I do now? I asked. Jonathan smiled grimly. Now? Now we go to Portland and inform Patricia that she's been living in and selling property that doesn't belong to her. And then we call the police. We drove back to Portland that evening, and the next morning, Jonathan and I went to the Multnomah County Recorder's office to get certified copies of the deed. The clerk who helped us was a young woman named Jessica who looked at the documents with growing alarm. This is strange, she said, typing information into her computer. The deed shows the property was transferred to you on May 6, 2023. But there's another document here. She clicked through several screens. Someone filed a correction deed on August 15, 2023, claiming the May 6th deed was filed in error and should be voided. It says the property should have remained in Daniel Morrison's name. Who filed the correction? Jonathan demanded. According to this, Patricia Morrison, as executor of the Daniel Morrison estate. She filed it with an attorney named Gerald Foster representing her. I felt cold fury wash over me. They knew, they found out about the deed, and they tried to erase it. But that's not how property law works, Jonathan said, his jaw tight. You can't just file a correction to undo a legitimate property transfer. That's not legal. The original deed stands. Jessica, can you print out all documents related to this property for the last 2 years? 20 minutes later, we had a stack of papers that told a damning story. The original deed transferring the house to me. The fraudulent correction deed filed by Patricia and Gerald. A listing agreement with a real estate agent dated September 1st, 2023. A purchase agreement dated April 20th, 2024. Showing the house under contract to sell for $875,000. And a scheduled closing date, June 3rd, 2024, which was 5 days from now. They're about to sell my house to someone else, I said, my voice hollow with shock. They're going to complete the fraud. Not if we stop them first, Jonathan said grimly. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Yes, I need to speak to Detective Marcus Webb in the fraud division. Tell him Jonathan Hayes is calling about a real estate fraud case that's about to close. The next 3 hours were a blur. Detective Webb, a Portland Police Bureau investigator specializing in property fraud, met us at the county recorder's office and reviewed all the documents. His expression grew darker as he read. This is pretty cut and dry, he said finally. The original deed is legitimate and properly recorded. The correction deed is fraudulent. You can't just erase a property transfer because you don't like it. And now they're attempting to sell property they don't own. That's felony theft, fraud, and forgery at minimum. What happens now? I asked. Now I contact the title company handling the sale and inform them there's a fraud investigation. That'll stop the closing. Then I get warrants for Patricia Morrison and Gerald Foster. Do you know where Patricia is currently located? San Diego, I said, giving him the address Gerald had written down for me. Detective Webb made notes. I'll coordinate with SDPD. California and Oregon have reciprocity agreements for felony warrants. We'll bring her back here to face charges. He looked at me with something like sympathy. I'm sorry this happened to you, Ms. Morrison, but we're going to make this right. That afternoon, I met with the real estate agent who'd listed my house. Her name was Carol Stevens. and she looked genuinely shocked when I showed her the deed and explained the situation. Mrs. Morrison told me she'd inherited the house from her deceased husband, Carol said, her hands shaking slightly as she reviewed the documents. She had a death certificate, a will, letters testamentary naming her as executor. Everything looked legitimate. I never thought to do an independent title search because the title company does that as part of the closing process. Did she seem nervous? Suspicious at all? Carol thought for a moment. She seemed eager. Very eager to close quickly. She kept calling me asking if we could accelerate the timeline, if we could close earlier than scheduled. When I told her the buyers needed time for inspection and financing, she seemed frustrated. She even offered to reduce the price by $50,000 if they'd agree to an as-is sale with a 10-day close. She knew I was coming home, I said, the pieces clicking together. She knew my deployment was ending, and she was trying to sell the house before I got back. Jonathan nodded grimly. The question is, how did she know you were coming home? Military deployment schedules aren't exactly public information. That question haunted me as I left Carol's office. How had Patricia known my timeline? How had she known to rush the sale? Unless... I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my old emails, looking for the messages I'd sent to my father during deployment. And there it was. An email I'd sent him in January, before he died, telling him I'd be home in late May. Can't wait to see you, Dad. My deployment ends May 25th. I'll be home before June. Patricia must have had access to his email account. She'd read my messages. She'd known exactly when I'd be returning, and she'd planned accordingly. Detective Webb moved fast. Within 48 hours, he had warrants for Patricia Morrison and Gerald Foster. Patricia was arrested at her San Diego apartment by SDPD and extradited back to Oregon. Gerald was arrested at his office, led out in handcuffs in front of his associates and clients. I watched from the gallery when they were arraigned at the Multnomah County Courthouse. Patricia looked different from the last time I'd seen her. Thinner, harder, her blonde hair shorter and darker, like she'd been trying to change her appearance. When the judge read the charges, fraud, forgery, attempted theft, conspiracy, her face remained blank, emotionless. Gerald, on the other hand, looked terrified. His expensive suit couldn't hide the sweat stains under his arms or the tremor in his hands. When he entered his plea of not guilty, his voice shook. The bail hearing was brief. The prosecutor argued that Patricia was a flight risk given that she'd already relocated to California and had been attempting to liquidate assets. The judge agreed and set bail at $500,000. Gerald's bail was set at $250,000. As they were led out of the courtroom, Patricia's eyes met mine for the first time. And she smiled. It was a small, cold smile that said she wasn't beaten, wasn't done, wasn't finished with me yet. That afternoon, Jonathan and I met with the prosecutor, an assistant DA named Rachel Kim, who specialized in financial crimes. She was in her 40s, sharp and professional, with a reputation for being relentless. This is a strong case, she said, reviewing the evidence. We have clear documentation of the fraud. The question is, what else were they doing? Fraudsters like this rarely stop at one crime. What do you mean? I asked. I mean, if Patricia was willing to forge documents to steal your house, what else did she do? Your father had cancer. Was he on pain medication? Did he have valuable assets beyond the house? Did Patricia have power of attorney? Access to his bank accounts? I hadn't thought about that. I don't know. I was deployed. I didn't even know he'd gotten sick until he was already dead. We need to do a complete audit of your father's finances, Rachel said. I'm going to subpoena his bank records, credit card statements, everything. If there's more fraud, I want to find it. The audit took 2 weeks. What Rachel found was stunning in its scope and audacity. Patricia had systematically drained my father's accounts in the months before and after his death. She'd transferred $340,000 from his retirement accounts to offshore accounts. She'd taken out credit cards in his name and maxed them out. She'd sold his car, his medical equipment, his life insurance policy, everything she could liquidate. In total, she'd stolen over $800,000. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Rachel found when she pulled my father's medical records and compared them to his prescription records. "Your father was prescribed morphine for pain management," Rachel explained, showing me the documents. But according to these pharmacy records, Patricia was refilling his prescription every 2 weeks instead of every month. She was getting double the amount she should have been getting. Either she was selling the extra morphine or she was overdosing him, I finished, feeling sick. She was giving him too much to keep him sedated, confused, unable to fight back. "We can't prove that definitively," Rachel said carefully. "But combined with the fraud, the forgery, the systematic theft, I'm adding financial exploitation of an elderly person to the charges, and I'm going to recommend the police investigate whether his death was truly from natural causes." They exhumed my father's body on a Tuesday morning in late June. I stood in the cemetery with Jonathan, watching the backhoe dig into the earth where I'd never gotten to say goodbye, where I'd never stood during the burial because I'd been halfway around the world. The medical examiner found what we'd suspected: morphine levels in my father's tissue samples that were 3 times higher than they should have been. He'd been systematically overdosed in the weeks before his death, kept in a fog of medication that prevented him from being able to defend himself or change his legal arrangements. "It's not quite murder," the ME explained. "He had terminal cancer. The morphine probably hastened his death, made him more comfortable in some ways, but it also kept him from being lucid. It's medical battery, elder abuse, but proving murder would be difficult given his underlying condition. But to me, it was murder. Patricia had killed my father, slowly, methodically, while pretending to care for him, while sending me cheerful emails about how she was taking such good care of Dad, while planning to steal everything he'd tried to leave me. I went back to the empty house that night and sat on the floor in my father's bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of furniture that used to be there. I'd been sleeping in a sleeping bag I'd bought at REI, eating takeout because there was nothing in the kitchen. The house felt like a mausoleum, a memorial to everything I'd lost. Jonathan had assured me the property was legally mine. The fraudulent correction deed had been voided, the sale had been stopped, and the title was clear. But knowing I owned the house didn't make it feel like home. Not with everything gone. Not with every room echoing with absence. I opened my laptop and started going through the digital copies of photographs Karen had scanned for me from the boxes she'd saved. My mother's face smiled at me from the screen, young and healthy in pictures taken before I was born, before the cancer, before the accident that killed her. My father looked so young in these photos, so happy, so full of life. And then I found a folder I hadn't noticed before, labeled "For Sarah." Inside were video files. I clicked on the first one. My father's face appeared on screen, gaunt and weak, clearly filmed sometime in his final weeks. "Sarah Bear," he said, his voice hoarse. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone and you found out about Patricia. I'm so sorry, baby girl. I'm so sorry I brought her into our lives. I'm so sorry I didn't see who she really was until it was too late." He coughed, and someone off-screen, Patricia, I realized with cold fury, asked if he needed water. He waved her away. "I've done what I can to protect the house," he continued. "The deed is recorded. Jonathan has all the paperwork. But I need you to know something else. Something important." He leaned closer to the camera, his eyes intense despite his illness. "The house isn't the only thing I protected. There's money, Sarah. Money that Patricia doesn't know about. Money. I've been hiding for you since your mother died." My breath caught. In the basement, behind the old furnace, there's a loose brick in the wall. 3rd row from the floor, 7th brick from the left. Behind that brick is a key. That key opens a safe deposit box at Columbia Bank. Box number 247. In that box is everything: account information, bonds, stock certificates. Almost $2 million that I've been saving and investing for you since you were 9 years old. Don't let Patricia find it. Don't tell anyone about it until you're sure it's safe. Use it to rebuild your life. Use it to fill this house with joy again. Use it to live the life your mother and I always wanted for you. I love you, Sarah. I'm so proud of you, and I'm so sorry I won't be there to see what you become. The video ended. I sat staring at the blank screen, tears streaming down my face, my hands shaking. My father had left me a fortune that Patricia had never found, never suspected, never stolen. I waited until midnight, until I was sure no one was watching the house, and then I went down to the basement with a flashlight. The basement had been emptied too. The washer and dryer were gone, the shelves cleared, but the old furnace was still there, too heavy and worthless to bother moving. I found the brick exactly where Dad had said it would be. Behind it was a small brass key, and the next morning I went to Columbia Bank and opened safe deposit box 247. Inside was everything he'd promised, and more. Account statements showing systematic investments over 15 years. Bonds in my name. Stock certificates for companies like Microsoft and Amazon, purchased decades ago and worth a fortune now. And a letter. Sarah, this is your future. This is your freedom. Don't waste it. Don't let Patricia's cruelty poison your life. Build something beautiful. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. Love, Dad. Patricia's trial was scheduled for September, but 3 days before jury selection was supposed to begin, Rachel Kim called me with news that changed everything. Patricia wants to make a deal, she said. She's willing to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. But there's a condition. What condition? She wants to talk to you. She says she has information about your father's death that you need to hear. Information that will change how you see everything. I didn't want to see her. Didn't want to hear whatever lies she'd concocted to try to reduce her sentence. But Rachel convinced me it might be worth it. Sometimes defendants reveal things they don't realize are incriminating, she explained. And sometimes they just want the satisfaction of hurting their victims one more time. Either way, I'll be there. Nothing she says to you can be used against you, and anything she says can be used against her. You have all the power in this situation. So I agreed to meet Patricia in the interview room at the Multnomah County Detention Center. She was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hair unwashed, her face bare of makeup. She looked older than I remembered, harder. She sat down across from me and smiled that same cold smile from the courtroom. Hello, Sarah. What do you want? I asked, my voice flat. I want you to know the truth, she said. The truth about your father, about your precious, perfect father who you think was so noble and good. I'm not interested in your lies. It's not a lie, Patricia said, leaning forward. Your father was having an affair. Did you know that? For years, starting about 6 months after your mother died. I stood up to leave, but Rachel put a hand on my arm. Let her talk, she whispered. Let's see where this goes. He met her at the hospital where he worked, Patricia continued. A nurse named Elizabeth Hayes. They were together for almost 8 years. He was going to marry her, Sarah. He was going to give her everything. But then she died. Car accident. Very tragic. And he was alone again. That's when he found me. My mind was reeling. Elizabeth Hayes. Jonathan Hayes. What are you saying? I'm saying your father had a whole other life you didn't know about. Elizabeth had a son your father treated like his own child. A son who became a lawyer. A son named Jonathan. The room tilted. You're lying. Am I? Patricia pulled out a photograph that her lawyer must have brought her. It showed my father, with a woman I'd never seen before, and a teenage boy. They looked like a family. Jonathan Hayes is your father's illegitimate stepson, And everything your father told you about protecting you, about the deed, about the hidden money, that was all Jonathan's idea. Not to help you, Sarah, to help himself. That doesn't make any sense, I said, but my voice sounded uncertain even to me. Doesn't it? Think about it. Jonathan finds you right after your father dies. He has this convenient deed that gives you the house. He helps you discover all this fraud. He makes himself indispensable to you. And I'm guessing he's told you about money, hasn't he? Money your father left you? I didn't answer, but my face must have shown something because Patricia's smile widened. Here's what you don't know, Sarah. That safe deposit box? Jonathan knows about it. Because your father told Elizabeth about it years ago, and Elizabeth told Jonathan. And the reason Jonathan drew up that deed wasn't to protect you. It was to make sure you got the house so you'd be grateful to him, so you'd trust him. So when you found the money, you'd let him help you manage it. He's been playing you from the beginning. Why should I believe anything you say? Because I have proof, Patricia said. She nodded to her lawyer, who handed Rachel a folder. Those are emails between Jonathan and Elizabeth from 2015, talking about your father's estate planning, talking about how much money he had hidden away, talking about how, when the time comes, we need to make sure it goes to the right people. Jonathan has known about your inheritance for years, and he's been positioning himself to take a piece of it. Rachel opened the folder and started reading. Her expression shifted from skepticism to concern. Sarah, we need to verify this, but these emails appear to be genuine. I felt like the ground was falling away beneath me. No, Jonathan helped me. He saved my house. He did exactly enough to make you trust him, Patricia interrupted. And now you're going to give him access to $2 million, aren't you? You're going to let him manage your inheritance. And over the years, piece by piece, he's going to steal it all, just like I tried to steal the house. Only he's smarter about it, more patient. I left the detention center in a daze. Rachel drove me back to her office, where we spent the next 4 hours going through every document Jonathan had ever given me, every piece of advice he'd offered, every action he'd taken. The evidence was damning. Jonathan had known about the safe deposit box. There were notations in my father's file that referenced Columbia account, discussed with J.H. He'd known about the hidden money before I did. He'd positioned himself as my savior, my only ally, the one person I could trust. And he'd asked, just 2 days ago, if I wanted him to help me set up a trust to manage the inheritance. These things are complicated, he'd said. You need professional management. I can handle it for you. Make sure it's invested properly. Rachel made calls. Within hours, we discovered that Jonathan Hayes had been disbarred in California in 2010 for misappropriating client funds. He'd moved to Washington State and started fresh, but his license there was under review for similar allegations. He was a con man. A sophisticated, patient con man who'd identified me as a target the moment my father died. But the deed is real, Rachel confirmed after speaking with the county recorder. The house really is yours. That part wasn't a lie. Jonathan did file legitimate paperwork for your father. The question is why? The answer came when we dug deeper into the emails Patricia had provided. Jonathan and his mother Elizabeth had planned this for years. They would help my father protect his assets from any future spouse, make sure the house went to me, make sure I was grateful and trusting. And then, when the time came, they would help themselves to the money my father had hidden away. But Elizabeth had died in 2015, and Jonathan had to wait. Wait for my father to get sick. Wait for him to marry someone who would be an obvious villain. Wait for me to be deployed and vulnerable and desperate for help. And then swoop in as the hero. What do? I asked Rachel, feeling sick. First, we get a restraining order preventing Jonathan from having any contact with you or your finances. Second, we refer this case to the Washington State Bar for investigation. Third, you hire a different lawyer. one I recommend, one who's been vetted to handle your father's estate and your inheritance. And fourth, she paused. Fourth, you decide whether you want to press charges against him for attempted fraud. He didn't actually steal anything yet, I said. No, but he attempted to. He positioned himself to steal from you through fraud and manipulation. That's a crime. And if we can prove he was working with your father under false pretenses, if we can show he used his position of trust to attempt to defraud you, we can prosecute him. I thought about my father, sick and dying, thinking he was protecting me by working with Jonathan, thinking he was ensuring my future, never knowing that the son of the woman he'd loved was planning to rob his daughter. Press charges, I said, against all of them, Patricia, Gerald, Jonathan, everyone who tried to steal from me. The trials took almost a year. Patricia pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud, forgery, theft, and elder abuse. Gerald Foster lost his law license and was sentenced to 3 years for his role in the fraud. Jonathan Hayes was arrested in Washington and extradited to Oregon, where he was charged with attempted fraud and conspiracy. But it was Jonathan's trial that revealed the final, most devastating truth. During testimony, the prosecution introduced evidence that Jonathan had known about my father's relationship with Elizabeth for years, that he'd even lived with them occasionally as a teenager, that my father had paid for his college education, that he'd been like a father to Jonathan in many ways. And then Jonathan's defense attorney, trying to establish some kind of sympathy, revealed something that explained everything. Jonathan Hayes wasn't just Elizabeth's son from another relationship. He was my father's biological son. The courtroom went silent as the attorney presented DNA evidence, old letters, documents proving that my father and Elizabeth had had a child together in 1985, a son they'd given up for adoption to Elizabeth's sister because my father was still married to my mother at the time. A son who'd come back into their lives years later, after my mother's death, when my father had tracked him down and tried to build a relationship. I had a brother, a half-brother I'd never known existed, and that brother had tried to steal my inheritance. The revelation shattered me in ways I couldn't articulate. My father had lied to me my entire life. He'd had another family, another child, another whole life I'd known nothing about. The perfect father I'd idealized was flawed, human, capable of betrayal. Jonathan was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years. As he was led out of the courtroom, he looked at me and said, "He loved me too, you know. Before you were born, I was his son, and then you came along and I became the secret." How do you think that felt? I didn't answer because I didn't know. I didn't know anything anymore. I spent the next 6 months in therapy, working through the layers of betrayal and loss and confusion. I used some of the inheritance money to restore the house, buying back furniture that matched what had been sold, filling the rooms with new memories while trying to honor the old ones. And then, one day in spring, I received a letter. It was from a woman in Seattle named Emma Morrison. She said she'd read about the trial in the newspapers. She said she had information about my father that I might want to know. I almost threw the letter away. I'd had enough revelations, enough secrets, enough truths that shattered my understanding of my family. But something made me call her. "Thank you for calling," Emma said when she answered. "I wasn't sure if you would. I'm your father's sister, your aunt, and there are things about your family history that you need to know." We met at a coffee shop in Portland. Emma was in her 70s, elegant and kind, with eyes that reminded me of my father's. "Your father didn't have an affair with Elizabeth," she told me gently. "He and your mother were separated when he met Elizabeth. Your mother had asked for a divorce. She was having her own affair with her doctor, the one who later treated her cancer. Your father met Elizabeth during that separation. They fell in love. She got pregnant. And then what? Then your mother's affair ended. The doctor didn't want to leave his wife. Your mother came back to your father, begging for another chance, telling him she was willing to work on the marriage. And your father, who still loved her despite everything, agreed to try. He broke things off with Elizabeth. He never knew about the baby until years later, after your mother died, when Elizabeth tracked him down and told him about Jonathan. So he didn't cheat on my mother? No, sweetheart, he didn't. He was a good man who made complicated choices in a complicated situation. He tried to do right by everyone. Your mother, Elizabeth, Jonathan, you. Sometimes he failed, but he tried. Emma reached across the table and took my hand. Your father left you the house and the money because he loved you more than anything in the world. But he also left money for Jonathan in a separate account that Jonathan never knew about. He was trying to take care of both his children. He just didn't live long enough to tell Jonathan about it. How much? I asked. $500,000. In a trust that would have been activated on Jonathan's 40th birthday if your father had lived to set it up properly. I found the paperwork when I was going through old files after the trial. Jonathan never knew. He thought he was being cut out, being forgotten, being replaced by you. That's why he tried to steal your inheritance. He thought it was the only way to get what he felt he was owed. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed. What do I do with this information? Emma smiled sadly. That's up to you, sweetheart. You can keep it to yourself. You can tell Jonathan. You can honor your father's wishes and make sure Jonathan gets what your father wanted him to have. Or you can walk away from all of it and build your own life free from all these complications. Your father left you choices. He left you freedom. What you do with it is up to you. I drove home to the house on Hawthorne Street, the house that had been emptied and violated and fought over and finally reclaimed. I walked through rooms I'd slowly been filling with furniture and photographs and life, and I made a decision. I called Jonathan's lawyer and told him I wanted to visit Jonathan in prison. And when I sat across from my half-brother in the visiting room, I said 4 words that changed both our lives. Dad left you money. Oh, the expression on his face, shock, disbelief, grief, regret, told me I'd made the right choice. Because my father had been right about one thing. Family was complicated, messy, imperfect. But it was still family, and sometimes forgiveness was the only way forward. He never forgot about you, I told Jonathan, and neither will I.